You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 253 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. For those of you who want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or just go to libertarianinstitute.org. And the Libertarian Institute is where I publish my daily news roundup as well as the show Foreign Policy Focus, and both of those can be found on the homepage. First news story I have today is for the first time we have an F-35 crashing. I believe this occurred in South Carolina, so it must have been some kind of test flight. There's no word yet on what happened, so I'm not sure if this is another situation where there's been plenty of equipment malfunctions throughout the F-35 program with cockpits, catching fire and just numerous other problems, with this plane. However, it's very interesting to see it being portrayed in almost all media sites that this is the first time in the 17-year history of the program that one of these planes have crashed. And so if you're just reading that headline, you really do get the takeaway. And amazingly so that, this is a plane that's had very little problems. When in fact the exact opposite is true. This plane has been very late on the delivery of the technology, mostly because, there's just so many problems with this as it's gone along, and some of those have been safety problems as well. So be aware of that. And it's just another one of those cases where, you have Trump who talks about fake news in a very ham-handed way. And I think most of the cases that he would point to and claim fake news, I wouldn't necessarily agree with. But, this is, I think, the real kind of fake news issue, that you have a program like the F-35 that has been absolutely plagued with problems. It's cost, I believe, gonna cost like trillions of dollars more than was initially anticipated to cost. And yet the media's portrayal of it is, a plane finally crashes. I think luckily the pilot was able to inject and survive. But you now have the plane, and they herald it like, oh yeah, look at the great track record of this plane, when that's just not the case. Moving over to Europe. There's this coming referendum in Macedonia, to change the name of Macedonia. I think from the Republic of Macedonia to the Republic of North Macedonia. There's a long-standing issue, I believe, between Macedonia and maybe several of its neighbors, but particularly between Macedonia and Greece. I believe most northern province of Greece is Macedonia, and I guess the Greeks have a fear that if the Republic of Macedonia one day decides it wants to take back or conquer or something Macedonia, that they could lose that region of their country. I'm not quite sure how the internal politics within Greece play out. Maybe the people would consider themselves a separate group from the Greeks, let to join Macedonia, or there's some fear like that. However, this long-standing problem has prevented Macedonia from ever joining NATO, as Greece itself is a NATO member state. One of the important things here is that there's accusations of Russia trying to influence the referendum vote to get the people to vote against the name change. Now, from my understanding, this isn't like a binding referendum, and the government of Macedonia itself will actually be the ones to make this decision. However, I think it's kind of a close call scenario that the party that is the ruling party of Macedonia doesn't hold enough power to actually make this change without some opposition support. And I think the opposition is looking for the cover of a positive referendum vote in order to go along with the name change. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. I would just expect we see lots of claims of Russian propaganda if the results are in any way close to make the opposition doubt wanting to join NATO. Of course, the United States and kind of the establishment and those who made the claims of Russian influence abroad and Russian aggression and all of this are definitely on the side of Macedonia joining NATO. And so that, they're definitely going to be pushing this narrative if there's any contest at all in the results of that referendum. And I'm sure it is true that Russia, RT is probably doing some coverage here and putting out news stories, and Russia may be giving money to some actors within Macedonia, but NATO does this as well. And then this is just the name of the game. The United States, before the election in Hungary, I believe gave $500,000 to, kind of local opposition media within Hungary. And so the complaints always come, Russia, but really this is just kind of the grand strategy that's been, going on by both sides as the United States decided to expand NATO eastward. And now there's like political competitions in these countries because that's the path to join NATO. And so both sides are looking to influence the leadership of these countries, either to prevent them from joining or to, elect a government that wants to join NATO. I want to mention that the United States is sailing some ships through the South China Sea. We saw a lot of this going on right at the end of Obama's term and at the beginning of Trump's turn, until several ships, including the Fitzgerald and the McCain, had some collisions and ran aground. And I believe the commander of the 7th Fleet was actually replaced. And it seems that, there's been the occasional bomber flyovers of the South China Sea in probably the past year. But this is, it seems to be a little bit of an uptick in the ships, sailing through. I know one of the problems that they had identified before is that these U.S. ships are sailing around, this area without their locators on. And so, the other ships don't know that the U.S. ships are there. And I guess, if there's not like a beacon locating a ship there, you assume there's not one. And, this is in part led to some of the collisions that have happened between U.S. ships and mostly merchant ships. That has led to the death of some U.S. Sailors and, some innocent civilians just trying to make a living. Of course, the whole reason for this is the United States feels the need to continuously contest China's territorial claims to the South China Sea. The U.S. insists that if Chinese territorial claims to the South China Sea, which is a pretty large body of water, and there are several other countries, I believe, like the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, all have contesting claims with China to various areas around the South China Sea, and then the ownership of some islands out in the middle of the South China Sea. I believe there's 2 chains of islands, islands is probably a pretty loose term. I think these are just reefs, and China has actually started to dump material there in order to create an island. There's some pretty complicated international law stuff that actually plays out here if you're looking at what are the diplomatic or established ways to resolve these disputes. I think China kind of claims that this is an exception, that they have historical whatever property for controlling these islands. And also China is using their artificial islands out there as almost like little aircraft carriers. They put little air bases out there, missile defense positions and all this kind of stuff to combat U.S. threats in the area. Of course, the United States is pretty frequently, carrying out some kind of either drills or maneuvers around the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean area. So I really don't know what the solution to the problem is, but one country that definitely doesn't have a territorial claim to the area is the United States. And so it really isn't our business to be selling our ships there. Also, it's costing the U.S. taxpayers a lot of money. We know that these missions, while they seem completely safe, are actually somewhat dangerous at the very least, and could cause U.S. ships to run aground and U.S. ships to run into other ships. And, we lose U.S. sailors as well as, innocent people from other countries die. So these are not costless missions, and I think a lot of times they're portrayed to be and thought to be. I want to mention a little bit about Trump's UN speech, mainly focused on Iran. I didn't actually listen to or read the whole speech. I just have caught sound bites of it over the past week. It doesn't sound like there was anything really new or groundbreaking in the speech. I guess it's worth noting that leading up to the speech, the Trump administration, and I believe I heard this from Trita Parsi on the Scott Horton show, and I'll link to that in the show notes page. The purpose of Trump's speech there was going to be kind of against Iranian influence. However, he had to change it to non-proliferation, because if Iran was the focus of the speech, then Iran would have had a right to attend that Security Council meeting and speak. this would allow Iran's President Rouhani to kind of directly rebuff and speak at Donald Trump. So the U.S. decides not to do that, changes a little bit the topic of the speech, but all the same, Trump just tates on Iran during that speech. One of the, I think, just more covered aspects of the speech was apparently Trump was laughed at by some of the other world leaders. And so this just brings me a little bit to talking about one thing that I think the liberal, more establishment likes to talk about that I usually kind of dismiss a little bit because I think the way they talk about it isn't always correct. But they say that Trump is destroying American influence around the world. And they say this like, you know, the Iraq war never happened and Libya never happened and Yemen isn't happening. But at the same time, I do think that Trump really did hurt the U.S. Image in the world by withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. I think this is probably without a doubt the dumbest thing that Donald Trump has done. And I know there's a lot of terrible things out there, but you know, this was a good deal. It did improve relations with Iran. And basically the Trump administration came in, completely moved the goalpost. They changed it from making sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon to we need a deal with Iran that solves all of our problems with Iran, including Iranian influence in Iraq and Syria, including Iran's missile program, and then just simply fictitious things that Iran isn't even doing, like arming the Houthis and, you know, beating pretty much the leading supporter and cause of the war going on right now in Yemen. And so I do think in that way, Trump has actually hurt America's image in standing around the world. And it's not just, you know, that it's his bluntness and rudeness and the terrible things that he says, many of which are inappropriate. But it's also the fact that he creates these diplomatic situations where people are having to take sides. And he's just making it so economically inadvantageous for some of these countries to take the side of the U.S. that they're switching sides. If you look at what's going on with the oil sanctions against Iran, the Europeans know that the Iranians were staying within the agreement. The IAEA says so. The United States even admits that. The U.S. just kind of does an end round saying that, oh, the deal was harming our national security, and oh, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, in order to drum up fear to try to prove that Iran is doing something wrong. When, you know, really, I mean, you could definitely argue, you know, against some of the things that the Iranian Ba'ath militias have done in Iraq and Syria, and Assad's not a great guy. But at the same time, you know, this is a pretty complicated regional landscape within the Middle East, and Iran is an actor in the area. And so, you know, it seems to me that they have a little bit more of a case to make to intervene there than the United States, especially when you have things like terrorist attacks that actually do occur in Iran. You had a shooting at a military parade. I believe 24 killed total, including a couple children. You had two groups claim responsibility for that attack, a separatist group in Iran and then the Islamic State. I did hear they captured a couple of the shooters or plotters or somehow people associated. So we'll see maybe if we do get some actual answers. Iran pretty quickly jumped to blame the Western countries, specifically the United States, and then our Arab ally states, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There's a couple of pretty good Scott Horton show episodes, kind of about the U.S. situation with Iran right now. One with Trita Parsi and one with Philip Giraldi, and I'll link to both of those in the show notes page. Trita does a pretty good job of making the case that, you know, while typically it would be pretty ridiculous to just kind of outright blame the United States for this attack without proof, but in the past year you've had many officials either in the Trump administration or pretty close to it, like Rudy Giuliani, John Bolton being a Trump administration official, Mike Pompeo, who are all very hawkish against Iran. You have Giuliani saying that the Iranian government would go down before its 40th anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the revolution. I think that's next year, and have them calling for regime change in Iran. And so, you know, for the Iranians, the Americans are making these kind of threats. And we've seen with Saddam and Gaddafi and their attempt against Assad that they actually do follow through with this sometimes. And so I don't think you could just blanket say that, there's not some reason to suspect the Americans, the Israelis, or the Saudis, or the Emirates from being in some way behind this terror attack. Then not that you could just outright accuse them of it, and just point the finger and say they're absolutely guilty. But at the same time, there's a reason to suspect them. I think the UAE even, when their leadership encouraged this in a tweet. To tie up just a few more diplomat things that have to do with Iran. Iran's foreign minister said the country is very close to, sealing some kind of oil agreement with, the European countries. And, this would be a pretty big thing, especially with the announcement of the kind of payment facilitating vehicle, with Iran and Russia, China, France, Germany, and the UK. So, as I was saying before, with the situation that Trump has created for himself, I think he actually has, really hurt U.S. interests. And you're seeing now all these countries, move towards taking, I don't want to say taking Iran's side in the issue, but certainly, resisting the Trump administration's push to isolate Iran. Now, I don't know how impactful this is actually going to be, because at the end of the day, the United States sanctions are very impactful, for the companies who are sanctioned. And so if any of, the European companies do business with Iran and then the U.S. sanctions them, it could really hurt their bottom line. It could, prevent them from buying products from U.S. companies. And so it could get very messy very quickly. And, for that reason, there may not be a whole lot of European countries that continue to do business with Iran in the face of the U.S. sanctions. The other issue going on, here for the United States and Iran is in the southern Iraqi city of Basra. For the past couple weeks, there have been some pretty popular protests in Basra, to the one point where actually I believe some Iraqi government sites were attacked by the protesters and burnt down. The United States decided to move their consulate out of Basra and I think just relocated the diplomats to Baghdad. The United States is pointing the finger at Iran for this decision, saying kind of it's Iran that's inciting these protests. When you look at the situation on the ground in Basra, I'm sure a lot more important to the people than whatever Iran is saying or trying to influence them as is, their standard of living. The fact that most of the oil wealth in Iraq exists in, this area. And, this was one of the least hard hit areas by Iraq War III, the ISIS invasion of Iraq. And yet the people in this area, that are mostly Shiites are really, suffering, and the government programs in the area aren't very good. Their public works are absolutely terrible. And so I think it's a stretch to say that, this is all the fault of the Iranians and not, the corruption and the destabilization in Iraq created by the Americans back in 2003. And also the fact that Iran really has any influence in Iraq or any major influence in Iraq is all the fault of the Americans under George Bush. In a speech, I believe in West Virginia, Trump mentioned Saudi Arabia along with, I believe, Germany and South Korea as militaries the United States is needlessly subsidizing. Trump very rarely, kind of takes shots at Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. And part of the reason why is like 10% of these countries' GDP is enormous, is spent on military. And so I'm not quite sure how much more these countries could really spend on military. Now, maybe Trump is saying to, them that they should be doing less militarily. However, most of what they're doing is just, using the U.S. weapons and stockpile of bombs we gave them in Yemen. And then I just want to make a little side point, real quick here. And just on the topic of the UN and Trump's speech there and, really just blasting Iran for everything going on in the Middle East and all of his problems. Trump could look a lot more even-handed if we weren't taking the side of Saudi Arabia and Yemen and he were condemning, the Saudis and the Emiratis for how they're destabilizing and creating problems in Yemen. And so, Trump not doing that, just shows that this is all just his posturing and hawkishness against Iran. And he isn't in any serious way concerned about like the humanitarian welfare of the people of the Middle East. We see this in other ways too. There was a Egyptian woman who I guess, went on a Facebook live rant about how she was sexually harassed and nobody did anything about it. And, very brave for her speaking out. And then she gets jailed for 2 years and, I believe on fake news charges. So, this is a U.S., quote unquote ally, and Trump, chats with Sisi and they apparently get along. He's the dictator of that country. And yet, all of his focus is, on humanitarian issues and, in the greater Middle East, target, the enemies of the American, kind of military industrial complex, Syria and Iran. All right, just a couple more things I want to talk about real quick. 2 Afghani police commanders were killed in an insider attack. New recruit turns his weapon on his commanders and either gets killed in the process or flees. It continues to be a problem for the Americans and for the Afghani government. I talked a little bit about on last show on just how weak the Afghan government or Afghan military is and how many casualties they're taking in the recruiting problems. And so, this is just all part of how the Americans, I think at this point, are fighting a losing war in Afghanistan. Not that there was ever really any objective that they could win. But now it seems that the Taliban just kind of slowly taking more and more territory. In Gaza, we had 7 Palestinians, including 2 children, killed during protests. I was very interested to see that it seems that there's like a push in the mainstream media to kind of rewrite the history of what's going on here. In the article I read, the whole focus of the article wasn't on the protesters and, the plight of the people of Gaza, and what they're protesting for and how terrible it is that you have a military killing protesters or even justifying the protesters being killed by the military. I guess now there's not even the pretext that they have to justify it, just that if you're a Palestinian killed by the Israelis, it could be assumed that you're probably a terrorist. But the focus of the article is in Hamas and how Hamas has organized all these protests, since I believe March 30th, every Friday they go out. When from my understanding, I believe this was even conceded in some mainstream sources, during the first 6 weeks of the protests, that this was really independent from Hamas and that this was very popular protests and largely nonviolent. You have, the Palestinians maybe throwing Molotov cocktails, but the Israelis are pretty far away. They have slingshots and rods. Sometimes they'll tape a burning log or a burning, kind of bag with a condom at the end filled with an accelerant to a kite and let that drift over the fence, the wall of their jail. And then they push burning tires against the fence in order to, I think distort the view of the Palestinians, the Israeli snipers. I also thought it was interesting that, the article I read on NBC News really made it sound like Hamas gained control of Gaza in a military coup. And it wasn't, it's a much more complicated situation than that. And, the main power transfer occurred in U.S.-backed elections, where Hamas was voted by the people of Gaza to be the leadership of the territory. The Syrian foreign minister called for Syrian refugees to start coming home to Syria and said that this is going to be a priority of the Assad government. Maybe this is a way that he could gain some favor with Erdogan or some of the, his neighbor in Jordan, Lebanon, and some of the European countries where there's a lot of Syrian refugees, by having these people come home to Syria. I'm sure it's also important for the Syrian economy and everything else to, get a lot of these people back that, were working age people and will be important to the reconstruction of Syria. Russia announced that the S-300 systems are starting to arrive in Syria. And the last thing I want to talk about, another Scott Horton Show interview that I'll link to in the show notes page, this time with Philip Giraldi. He made some point that feel very bad that I missed in my analysis of the shoot down of the Russian plane by the Syrian air defense. I had pointed out how the Israeli had used that plane for kind of radar cover and then attacked Assad positions in Syria. And I guess kind of just assumed that, the Israelis would know that they would be fired upon. But Phil Giraldi points out that he thinks the assumptions of the Israelis is that taking this cover would have meant that, Assad wouldn't have fired on them. So, this is Kyle's words. I don't think Phil, made this kind of comparison on the show, on Scott's show, but, in some way, Russia does take a little bit of the blame, cause they gave weapons to an actor that didn't use them responsibly and it cost them one of their planes. I think that would be the critique would give the Americans had it been the Americans in the place of the Russians there. However, Israel still bears some of the blame. They shouldn't have been bombing Syria. It makes no sense for Israel to bomb Syria. It's just causing problems. And, we know it's Israeli policy to prolong that war. So listen to those interviews from Scott if you haven't already. And, check out my show. All my work is at libertarianinstitute.org. You can find the show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. I'm looking at moving away from Facebook. I'm getting tired of it. There's no news on there anymore. So, for those of you who, kind of find my work through Facebook, I would, suggest subscribing to like an RSS feed or a Twitter feed or a iTunes feed or something like that. I'm not going to stop posting my content there now, but that is probably something coming up in the coming months. And if you really like the show and you really want to support it, the best thing you could do is donate on Patreon. At times I do interviews like bonus content stuff, and I need to do another one of those soon. So all of you could listen to that, who are generous enough to support me. Thanks everyone. I'll be back on Wednesday.